My name is Claire Bennett. I am 32 years old, and for years I believed that if I worked hard enough, my family would finally see my worth. I paid their debts. I kept their lights on. I showed up at every holiday, waiting for the moment they might say I mattered. But Christmas has a way of ripping the mask off. That night my father raised his glass and told me I would always be a burden, and before dessert was served, I leaned close and whispered something in his ear that left him pale and silent. What would you do if the people who should love you most called you worthless at their table? Stay with me, because this is the Christmas that changed everything. It was Christmas Eve of 2024, and the Bennett house in Naperville was glowing with lights strung across the porch and a tree covered in ornaments that caught the firelight in the living room. The dining table stretched across the room, polished silver and crystal glasses lined up neatly, and the smell of roasted turkey mixed with cinnamon rolls filled the air. My family filled the chairs laughing, talking over one another, passing dishes down the table. I sat near the end, smiling politely, my hands folded in my lap, as if I could make myself invisible. My father Richard stood at the head of the table, a tall man with a voice that carried authority even when he did not raise it. He lifted his glass, his face calm and unreadable, and then his words cut through the air. "You will always be a burden." For a moment every sound stopped. Forks hung mid-air. The scrape of silverware against porcelain ceased. Even the fire seemed to hush. My chest tightened as if the air had been pulled from the room. Heat rose in my cheeks, not from shame, but from something heavier, older, a weight that had been pressing down on me my entire life. I looked around the table, searching for anyone to challenge him. Thomas, my younger brother, stared at his plate as if it held a secret. "Jessica?" My cousin smirked and leaned toward the girl next to her, whispering something that made them both laugh softly. My mother Eleanor reached for her napkin, adjusted it with careful precision, and kept her eyes down. She did not defend me. She never did. The silence stretched long enough for my father to take a slow sip of wine before the clatter of plates resumed. Conversation picked up again, thin and forced, as if his words had been nothing more than a passing comment. My heart was still pounding. I forced myself to breathe long and slow, and placed my glass back on the table before my fingers snapped the stem. I stared at the turkey cooling on my plate, the green beans growing soggy in their butter, and thought of all the nights I had worked late just to make sure bills were paid, lights stayed on, and this family had dinners like this to sit around. My father's words echoed in my ears. A burden. Jessica's laugh rose again, sharp against the hum of conversation. I shifted in my chair, my fingers curling around the edge of the napkin until it wrinkled under my grip. I could feel the burn in my throat, but I refused to let it spill out. Not tonight. Not in front of them. My father leaned back in his chair, content, while Thomas filled his glass again. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace, her face expressionless, and I caught the brief glance she gave me before looking away, as if my pain was too inconvenient to acknowledge. That silence was worse than the insult itself. I straightened slowly, pressing my shoulders back. My breathing steadied. I was not going to cry in front of them, not this time. The tree lights flickered across the silverware, and the fire crackled again, as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something had shifted. I pushed my fork into the turkey with just enough force that it scraped the plate, and a few heads turned toward me. I lifted my eyes and let them see the calm settling over me, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. The conversations grew louder again, but I barely heard them. My father's words replayed, mixing with every other dismissal I had ever endured, building into a storm I could no longer hold back. I knew this Christmas would not be another memory I buried. It would be the moment everything changed. And as I sat there with the weight of silence pressing on me, I remembered it had not started tonight. This humiliation had been prepared years ago, piece by piece, until I almost believed it myself. Almost. I remembered the spring of 2010 when I walked across the stage at Northwestern University, diploma in hand, my name called to polite applause from strangers. I scanned the bleachers, hoping to see even one familiar face, but the seats where my family should have been were empty. I told myself they must have been busy, that there was some explanation, but I knew the truth. They simply did not think it mattered. Later that evening, my father called briefly to ask if the ceremony was long. He did not ask how I felt, he did not congratulate me. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my small apartment with a cheap takeout meal that I pretended was a celebration. Only a few months later, Thomas scored a winning basket in his high school playoff game. The entire family packed the stands, banners, waving cheers loud enough to shake the rafters. My mother cried, my father clapped his son on the back with pride. That night they went out for ice cream as if it were a championship. I stayed home and studied, telling myself not to be jealous, but the sting never left. The pattern repeated year after year. I earned scholarships, took internships, worked 2 jobs at a time, and it was all treated as expected. Thomas brought home passing grades, and suddenly he was a miracle. When he got his driver's license, my father bought him a used car. When I asked for help with textbooks, I was told to be resourceful. In 2015, the house in Naperville was on the brink of foreclosure. My father had fallen behind on payments, and the bank was circling. He sat at the kitchen table one night with his head in his hands. My mother wrung her fingers, whispering about losing everything. I listened quietly, then withdrew the savings I had scraped together from years of part-time work and overtime hours. $10,000 transferred directly to cover the mortgage. I signed the paperwork myself, making sure the house would not be taken. When I told my parents what I had done, they looked relieved for a moment. Then my father nodded curtly and said it was good that I understood responsibility. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice it had taken. My mother poured herself another cup of tea and asked what time I was heading back to Chicago the next morning. The money was never mentioned again except in passing, as if it had been inevitable, my duty as the older child. Meanwhile, Thomas bragged about a new set of rims for his car, a gift from Dad. I smiled tightly, holding the receipts for the mortgage in my bag, the ink still fresh. There were moments when my father's words cut deeper than silence. Once, after a tense argument about my career choice, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I would never be enough." That sentence lodged inside me like glass, and no matter how many achievements I stacked against it, it stayed. Every success dulled by the echo of those 5 words. I carried that voice into every room I entered, every promotion, every relationship. I kept thinking that maybe if I did more, if I gave more one day, he would look at me differently. But he never did. And sitting at the Christmas table now with his latest insult still hanging in the air, I realized he never would. The truth was clearer than it had ever been. My father's toast was not an isolated cruelty. It was the culmination of years of dismissals, years of being invisible when I should have been celebrated, years of giving without recognition. And the weight of all those years pressed down on me as I stared across the glowing table, watching him laugh at some joke while the words burden still burned in my chest. I gripped my napkin tighter, my knuckles pale, and thought of every dollar I had given, every sacrifice I had made, and how easily it had been forgotten. That was when I understood that the humiliation at this table was not only about tonight. It was about everything they had taken for granted. And I also knew it would not end here because the years of unspoken debts were about to be reckoned with. I could see the numbers in my mind as clearly as if they were printed on the tablecloth in front of me. $10,000 in 2015, the year I pulled my parents' house back from the brink of foreclosure. I drained my savings account money I had earned through endless overtime and side jobs and wired it to the bank in time to stop the eviction notice. I still remember sitting in my small Chicago apartment that night, staring at the confirmation email, my body trembling from exhaustion, but my heart clinging to the hope that maybe they would finally see me. Instead, my father told me I had done what any responsible daughter should do. 2 years later, Thomas called in tears because his car was about to be repossessed. My father asked me to step in, saying it was temporary. $7,000 left my account within hours. I told myself it was an investment in family, that Thomas would one day remember who had saved him. But at Christmas that year, he bragged about the car as if he had worked for it himself. No one corrected him. I sat at the table smiling faintly while my chest burned. In 2019, Uncle Robert knocked on my apartment door in the middle of a snowstorm. His small business was failing creditors breathing down his neck. He promised to pay me back. He swore it was only a short-term loan. I gave him $15,000 because I could not bear to watch another relative crumble. Months passed, then years. The money never came back, and eventually his calls stopped altogether. The debt became another silent weight I carried alone. Then came 2021, when my cousin Daniel wanted to attend a trade school. He called me late at night, his voice hopeful, saying he just needed $1,000 for tuition to get started. I wired the money before morning. By spring, he had already dropped out. I did not even bother asking for the money back. And through 2022 and 2023, when my parents complained about rising costs, I set up automatic transfers. $500 every month, $12,000 in total, handed over quietly as if I were paying a bill. I watched my own dreams shrink to fit within the lines of my budget, saying no to vacations, no to luxuries, while they said yes to comfort. Not once did anyone look me in the eye and thank me. Not once did anyone acknowledge the nights I lay awake, wondering how long I could keep it all going. To them, my sacrifices were not generosity. They were entitlement their due. Now sitting at this Christmas table, I felt the fire that had been smoldering for years finally catch. If anyone deserved the label of burden, it was not me. It was the very people who had leaned on me until I bent under their weight. I reached for my glass of water, my hand steady now, and let the thought settle deep inside me. I was not the fragile daughter they painted me to be. I was the one who had carried this family through storms they pretended never happened. And I could feel that the moment was coming when the truth would no longer be hidden in bank statements and late-night transfers. The truth would have a voice, and when it spoke, it would not be gentle. The office in downtown Chicago glittered with end-of-year energy. Brightline Media had transformed the conference hall into a stage for celebration. Lights bounced off glass walls, tables overflowed with catered food, and the air buzzed with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. I stood near the front while my manager spoke about campaigns that had broken records. When my name was called, the room erupted in applause. Colleagues clapped me on the back, some raised their glasses, and I felt their pride wrapping around me like warmth from a fire. An email notification buzzed my phone almost immediately, the subject line congratulating me on my promotion to senior marketing manager. I read the words twice to be sure. It was official. I had fought my way here through long nights and endless meetings, and in this space I was seen respected and celebrated. Yet even in the middle of applause, I thought of that dinner table in Naperville. The same hands that once accepted my transfers now pointed at me as a burden. The sharp divide between who I was here and who I was at home cut into me like ice. That night when the party ended, and I walked through the snowy Chicago streets toward my apartment, my phone buzzed again. Helen Carter's voice filled the line steady and clear. She had been my closest friend since college, and as a lawyer she spoke with a kind of certainty I could never ignore. Keep every statement, every receipt, every wire transfer, she told me. Sooner or later, Claire, you are going to need them. Paper will say what people refuse to admit. Her words sank into me. I unlocked my apartment, set my bag down, and opened the drawer where I kept my files. One by one, I pulled out the records. Bank statements with my name printed at the top, mortgage payments highlighted, transfers marked ACH from C. Bennett, receipts for car loans, tuition, emergency checks. I stacked them neatly, feeling the weight of each page. I placed the papers into a fresh binder, labeling it with nothing more than the year. As I slid it onto the shelf, my eyes caught my own reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back was polished, strong, someone who had earned her place in a high-rise office. But I also saw the shadow of the girl who had waited for her family at graduation and stood alone. Both lived in me, and both demanded to be heard. I touched the spine of the binder once more, a quiet promise that this story would not stay hidden. The house was quiet, the city lights blinking through the blinds, and in that silence, I felt certainty growing inside me. There would be a time when these papers would matter more than every word my father had ever spoken. I turned off the lamp, leaving the binder in its place, and sat on the edge of my bed. Snow was still falling outside, covering the streets in white. I thought of the dinner table again, of Jessica's smirk, my mother's silence, my father's cruel toast. They believed the past would stay buried, that I would never use the truth I carried. They were wrong, because I knew the next time I faced them, I would not come empty-handed. The dining room felt smaller as the night dragged on the air, heavy with the smell of roasted turkey and wine that no longer tasted like celebration. Forks scraped against plates, conversations turned hollow, and I sat in silence, letting their words replay inside me. Jessica leaned forward, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced sweetness that hit a sharp edge. "You always make things more complicated, Claire." The laughter that followed was soft, but deliberate enough for me to hear, and to know it was meant for me. I looked across the table at Daniel, my cousin, hoping for even the smallest sign of discomfort. He kept his head down, pushing mashed potatoes around his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother adjusted the salt shaker, her lips pressed tight, offering no defense. My father poured himself another glass of Cabernet as if nothing had happened, his movements calm, his smirk casual. The dismissal in his posture stung worse than the words themselves. My hands tightened around the napkin in my lap until the fabric bunched. Years of swallowing the sting of letting moments like this pass unchecked pressed hard against my chest. My throat burned, but I would not let it break me. I forced myself to breathe slowly, each inhale controlled, each exhale steady. I was done letting silence protect them. Jessica's eyes darted to me, her grin widening when I did not immediately respond. She thrived on the imbalance, on the easy target I had always been. My father lifted his glass and chuckled at a joke someone made, never once acknowledging the tension thickening around us. I straightened in my chair, my decision solidifying. The muscles in my back ached from holding in the weight of years, but I stood anyway, the legs of my chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound that made several heads turn. Conversations faltered. I pressed the napkin flat on the table and set my fork beside my plate. I took one slow step forward, then another, the sound of my heels tapping against the floor echoing in the silence. My father looked up finally, eyebrows raised in mock surprise, as if he expected me to excuse myself from the table. My mother shifted in her seat, but kept her gaze low. Jessica leaned back, folding her arms, her smirk now uncertain. I stopped beside my father's chair, close enough to smell the wine on his breath. My hands no longer trembled. My eyes met his, steady and unflinching. I did not raise my voice, did not cry, did not allow even a trace of pleading to slip through. All those years of enduring quietly had brought me to this moment. My family thought I would break, as I always had, that I would shrink back into silence. But I could feel the weight of every sacrifice, every unacknowledged dollar, every slight, every word of dismissal gathering inside me. And I knew what I was about to do would change everything. I leaned closer until the chatter at the table fell away, and only the sound of my own breath filled my ears. My father's smirk lingered, but I could see the faint flicker of curiosity in his eyes. I bent to his shoulder close enough that no one else could hear, and whispered slowly, each word deliberate, telling him to check the mortgage statements from March 2022 through December 2024, and whose name appeared as the payer. His body stiffened. The stem of his wine glass shook against his fingers, a tremor that betrayed him before his face did. The color drained from his cheeks, his lips parted, and for once in my life, he had no words. I pulled back just enough to watch the realization crawl across his expression. This man who had held authority over me with every comment and every silence sat frozen, caught between shock and denial. The room quieted. Forks lowered, chairs creaked, eyes darted toward us. They could not hear what I had said, but they saw something shift. Jessica stopped smirking. Thomas straightened in his chair, puzzled. My mother pressed her hands together, knuckles, white eyes glued to her plate, as if it could shield her from what was unfolding. My father swallowed hard, the sound louder than it should have been. His glass tapped against the table when he set it down, his hand unsteady. He glanced at me as if to warn me not to continue, but I held his gaze calm and steady. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth was already tightening its grip on him. I straightened slowly, aware of every set of eyes following me. My hands no longer shook. My heart was steady, my breathing even. I had struck exactly where I intended, and though no one else yet understood, they would soon. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, tried to recover his composure. A nervous laugh escaped him, but it rang hollow. He reached for the wine again, only to set it back down, untouched. The silence stretched around him, uncomfortable and suffocating. I turned from him and walked back toward my chair. My footsteps echoed softly against the hardwood floor, each one heavier with purpose. Jessica whispered to the cousin beside her, but her voice carried none of the confidence from before. Thomas glanced at me, confusion written across his face. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone, though they still did not know why. I sat down and folded my napkin neatly across my lap. The fire crackled in the hearth, a sound that seemed suddenly too loud in the strained quiet. I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it carefully back on the table. My father had not moved. His stare was fixed somewhere on the tablecloth, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching against the stem of his glass. For the first time, I saw fear in him. It was not loud or obvious, but it was there, tucked into the corners of his expression. It was the fear of being exposed, the fear of losing control, and it gave me more strength than any cheer or applause ever had. The table tried to resume conversation, but the words faltered. My father's silence spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. I let the tension hang, knowing the moment was only beginning. Because the whisper was not the end. It was only the first crack in the wall, and soon the entire truth would be laid bare. I reached for my bag resting on the back of my chair and pulled it onto my lap. My fingers slid across the zipper slowly, the sound sharp in the tense quiet of the dining room. All eyes followed as I opened it and drew out a thick folder, the edges worn from months of being handled. I placed it on the table in front of me, the weight of it landing like a gavel. No one spoke. My father sat rigid, his eyes flickering nervously toward the folder. Jessica shifted in her seat, her confidence slipping. Thomas leaned forward as if he wanted to stop me but could not move. My mother adjusted her napkin, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate. I opened the folder and spread the first page across the table. A bank statement dated June 2015 showing a transfer of $10,000 to cover the mortgage payment. The words ACH from C. Bennett stood clear. I placed it flat for them all to see, then calmly laid down the next. A 2017 transfer of $7,000 for a delinquent car loan. Another from 2019, $15,000 to Robert Harris's failing business. In 2021, $1,000 for Daniel's tuition. Then, page after page, the automatic transfers from 2022 through 2023, $500 each month, $12,000 in total. The papers fanned out like cards in a dealer's hand, undeniable and unshakable. The fire popped in the hearth, the only sound in the room besides the soft slide of paper across wood. Thomas's face flushed. His mouth opened, then closed again. He slumped back, his arms crossed tight, as if he could make himself smaller. Jessica lowered her head, her earlier smirk erased. My mother shifted in her chair, finally looking at me but saying nothing, her lips pressed thin. My father did not move. His eyes scanned the documents, lingering on the numbers, the dates, the name that appeared again and again. His jaw tightened, the muscle twitching, as if he were biting back words he could not form. The silence pressed down heavier than any shout could have. I leaned forward, my voice steady and clear. From this night forward, I said, I will not pay another bill, another loan, another debt that does not belong to me. I am not the burden here. I have been the one carrying every single one of you. The words hung in the air like a verdict. No one dared to challenge them. The receipts were spread before them, each page a witness against their denial. The weight of years of sacrifice now sat in the open, no longer hidden, no longer dismissed. I gathered the pages, slowly stacking them neatly, the sound of paper crisp in the silence. My father's glass remained untouched, his hand still trembling faintly. The faces around the table were pale, drained of their earlier arrogance. I slid the folder back into my bag and placed it on the floor beside me. Then I folded my hands calmly on the table once again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had shifted. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves recognized the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. No one reached for dessert. The coffee sat cooling in the carafe. Forks rested untouched on plates. I sat in the quiet, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breath, the power of finally naming what had been buried for so long. And though the room had fallen into silence, I knew the reckoning was only beginning, because silence would not protect them from what came after. January settled over Chicago with bitter winds that cut across the river and snow piled against the curbs downtown. I woke each morning to the quiet hum of my apartment heater, opened my laptop, and threw myself into work. At Brightline Media, the new year brought a surge of projects, and my name was attached to every major campaign. For the first time in years, I felt no pull from Naperville, no late-night calls for money, no texts asking for help. The silence did not last long. News traveled quickly. Uncle Robert's business collapsed completely after the bank seized his last assets. The whispers in the family group chat turned to panic, but I stayed silent. Thomas called once, his voice tight with anger, complaining that his car had been repossessed. I listened without a word, then hung up before he could ask for another loan. My parents stopped receiving the monthly transfers, and soon their complaints reached me through cousins, each message dressed as concern, but heavy with accusation. Without my help, their comfort slipped away, piece by piece. I walked through the Loop one icy evening, the city alive with commuters, bundled against the cold, and I realized that none of it touched me anymore. Their chaos, their debts, their downfall no longer belonged to me. Michael met me at the corner cafe, his smile warm even in the freezing air, and he wrapped his arm around me as we walked back to my place. He did not ask about Naperville. He only asked about me, about the life I was finally building for myself. Helen called the following week. Her voice was steady, her advice sharp as always. She reminded me that boundaries were not walls, but lifelines, and that I had every right to keep mine firm. She asked if I had kept the folder safe. I told her it was locked in my desk drawer, every page intact. She paused, then said it might never need to see a courtroom, but it was power I should never surrender. One Saturday morning, I walked along the Chicago River, the ice breaking slowly across the surface, the city skyline gleaming in the pale sun. My breath rose in clouds, and for the first time in years, it felt light. The weight of their demands had lifted. I had carried them for so long that I forgot how it felt to stand straight, to breathe without guilt. I stopped at the railing, pressed my hands against the cold metal, and closed my eyes. My father's face came back to me, pale and speechless, at the table the moment his control cracked. I thought of Jessica's silence, Thomas's shame, my mother's refusal to meet my eyes. All of it led here to this peace that had taken decades to find. One whisper had silenced a room that had spent years silencing me. But more than that, it had freed me. I was no longer the burden, no longer the afterthought, no longer the quiet one who always gave without question. I was something else entirely now. And as the river moved slowly beneath me and the city pulsed with life around me, I knew I would never go back. Have you ever been dismissed by the people who should have valued you most? If you were in my place, what would you have done? Tell me your story.